that's enough for me. I'm now introducing Patricia McManus, who is the founder of the Dystopia Project. I met Patricia through Darko Suvin, who has become a very interesting colleague in many ways, but now that he would be with us today, but his life partner is very sick and cannot join us today. But with Darko's book on Disputing the Deluge, his anthology of his science fiction writings, I met again with Patricia, and when I was thinking of me hosting Gina's book, I had to go through in my brain, who in the world have I met who I think could really get a good conversation going, and I selected Patricia. And I thank you so much for taking the time, Patricia. Gina, I want to say, after you accepted this, I saw your conversation at that bookshop down in DC, I forget the name of it, on bibliolepsy. And I've been wanting to get that book ever since, because you reminded me of my childhood, even though I think you took this bike trip or foot trip more than I, but I used to escape to my library and just roam the shelves. The whole discussion was such a beautiful night for me. I saved the recording, and I encourage people, after you finish Insurrecto 1, 2, or 3 times, to go to some of Gina's other works. Enough about me or my talking about this stuff. I'm going to turn. We didn't even get around to discussing who, but I think, Patricia, you open up, and we'll start our discussion of Insurrecto. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael, and thank you so much for inviting me, everyone at Marxist Education Project.
Yeah,
great.
I echo that as well, Michael. Thanks a million, and for all the excellent publicity work that you've done as well. So I think if everybody's happy with it, we'll just keep it as straightforward as simple as possible. So I'm gonna talk to Gina with Gina's agreement. For maybe about 40 minutes, 50 minutes. And hopefully we'll get to cover a good bit of ground about Insurrecto and some of the ways in which it does a huge amount of political work whilst being a story, and also a huge amount of historical work. So if we take that lump of the time that we have, and then we'll turn it over to yourselves, and feel free to put a question in the chat, or feel free to use the raise hand function, or just to jump in. And I'm sure that Gina will be a fount of wisdom. So I'm going to start just by saying a little bit about the books that Michael has already mentioned. Gina's first novel was published in 1997 in the Philippines, and thank God it's been reissued as well for those of us not in the Philippines. It's just been reissued too by Soho Press, and that is the wonderful Bibliopsy. I don't know if people can see that there, but that is it's a lark, as Virginia Woolf would say, and also deeply serious about the relationships between literature and politics, and between reading and readers and politics, rather than just writing itself. Gina's second novel, The Revolution According to Raymond Massa, was published in 2009, and that too has been reissued in 2021. And again, this is a fantastic novel for anybody who's interested in particular in what language can do, or what can be done to language in the course of telling a story. The third novel, published in 2012, and I think it was the first of Gina's novels to be published from the beginning in America rather than in the Philippines, and that is The Gun Dealer's Daughter. And it is beautiful, a tremendously ambitious novel about a young woman in Manila, and the way in which the events of her time become her as well. The fourth novel, the one that we're going to be speaking about, I'm afraid I didn't manage to get the copy with the beautiful art that the Marxist Education Project used to advertise this event. But this is still, it's the Fitzcarraldo edition, and they're a great press. Insurrecto is the novel that we're going to talk about. I'm not going to summarize what's it about, because it's the type of novel that kicks away questions about being what a thing is about. But I am going to ask Gina, the first question, I think, is why Insurrecto as a title?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And all of your questions, I mean, I read through your questions and the different comments that you were making. I really appreciate all of the very, very deep understandings of the novels that you were offering me. Insurrecto was not the original title of this novel. I had called it The Unintended, and it, you know the way publishers work. It wasn't a phrase that came up nicely in the marketing. So it had originally been called Unintended, and they had all of these other titles from me. And when they wanted a different title and they wanted something called Insurrection, et cetera, I realized that maybe the misnomer, maybe the misrecognized term by the Americans, Insurrecto, might be useful. It already sets up the layers of reading of the novel that maybe I was interested in, and though it does misdirect you in using the American term or the Spanish term. For the Americans use the Spanish term for the Filipino revolutionaries, it already puts us in this place of rereading, reimagining, rethinking the language that we use.
Yeah, it is. It was a dig to my own thinking as well, because I think, like contemporary terms, insurgent or jihadi as well, quite often their use conceals their history and the important ways in which that history has been anti-colonial, or that history has been anti-imperial. So I think even though The Unintended is a great title, you can keep that for something else. But Insurrecto, I love it. And there's a moment in the novel as well where one of your characters actually realizes that this is what she is. She's no longer hearing about the insurrectos. This is what she is. I wonder, would that be something that might start if I find my place. So this is correct me now if I get it wrong, in Balangija.
In Balangiga.
Balangiga. So this is perhaps my favorite character. And again, forgive me if I get this wrong, Cassiana Nacionales.
Yes, and that name is a name that I had found on the list of revolutionaries, Sama revolutionaries in the plaza, Balangiga Plaza, when I visited, and it was the only woman's name that I found on the list. And I definitely wanted, so to be honest, once I saw that name, I just thought, she's in my novel. And I made her, for me, in my opinion, she's the center of my novel.
She's, I mean, because I was trying to map, and this might be helpful as well for some of the people who are here as well. I was trying to map, to externalize events in the novel, and normally I do that by creating a circle and then having radiating out from it. I couldn't do that with Insurrecto. It had to be, there's a block, and that block is 1901. That block is, I think you describe it as the two stages in what happened in Balangiga, in Samar in 1901. The two stages, the insurrection and then the viciousness of the American response. So Cassiana is at the center of that, but there's a couple of other centers, which it's not possible to create an architecture for the novel in that way, because every moment, and there are, I suppose, three historical moments: 1901, 1970s and contemporary Filipino history as well. But each one of those moments is saturated with the consciousness of each other. So let me just give the listeners a quotation from the novel that involves this woman, Cassiana Nacionales. And then maybe you can speak a little bit more about her role in the events and the job that you had to do to translate that into writing. Because it's a difficult passage, but it's a beautiful passage. So the burning of the rice forced by the American troops so that the insurrectos would be visible, so that the fighters would be visible at the attack. And now I'm going to quote from the novel. So insurrectos will starve because they will not have rice. Damn, damn, damn the insurrectos. It occurred to Cassiana, who had always believed it a mere story, a separate thing, this revolution that was a plot beyond their lives. It meant nothing to her. But that's it, she thought. That is who we are, insurrectos. That is how she explained it to the women. We are the insurrectos. There is no one else to do it but us. How strange it is to understand finally who she is, insurrecto. And they agreed. End quotation. So can you tell us a little bit, that moment of glee you must have had when you found her name? Mm-hmm. How did you go about that moment to her job in the novel?
Yeah, I had done a lot of research already, and I decided I was going to go home to check out Balaniga. And I had already read a little bit. She's called, and there is an essay about her called the Hieronima of Samar, or Geronima of Samar. So you can hear already the American period in that term. She's a Geronimo. So she's an Apache. She's and here's another thing about the term Apache, for instance. In my language, Waray, there's a term that we have for a bad person or someone who's a betrayer or someone who's an enemy, and that word is pachis. Now, pachis doesn't sound like a Filipino term because the ch sound is not really Filipino. So for a long time, I was trying to figure out where that word came from. It was only when I was older, and I haven't really talked to linguists about this, but I really think that term comes from Apache. It comes from the American period, and there's an aspect of language in the Philippines that gets fossilized because, for instance, in the town that my mom grew up in, it's so isolated, it's so inland that history gets fossilized in the language, and the fact that we as children would be using this weird term that no one else uses, to be honest. It comes from this particular area of Leyte. So that the fact that the Filipino scholar called, and apparently the people of Samar called Cassiana Hieronima, brings us to that kind of the settler colonial history of the United States, to the fact that this revolution, this period in Philippine history is so much part of American history. It's part of the Indian Wars. You know, that's how some American scholars would look at this too, because the soldiers, the officers of the Indian Wars were also in the Philippines. So anyway, I really was fascinated by Cassiana. I decided to use her actual name because her name is Cassiana Nacionales. Now, for a nationalist history of the Philippines, that is crazy. So there's nothing known about her. I asked them in Balaniga. The family is still there. I asked them what they knew about Cassiana, and they really had no stories. But that's what she's known for, the rosary that she gave the signal for the start of the fight. And what I decided to do was really center the women, center Cassiana and the other women as the instigators, as the people who made their men fight. Because I do think that in Philippine history, although the women are erased in the revolution, they really are. There are only a few women who are mentioned, although there are some famous women who are part of that history. I do think that they would have been really primal forces for the fights because, you know, they're the ones who cook, They're the ones, this concept that I'm not going to fuck you if you don't go to war. Obviously an ancient Greek type of thing too. But I do think that would have been very, very much part of the war. So that was how I moved the novel, and the concept that the consciousness of revolution is in the consciousness of women, I thought was really important to a real history of this Filipino war.
You get that. I mean, even just in the sentences I read, it occurred to Cassiana, who had always believed it a mere story, a separate thing, the revolution, the plot. It comes from outside until she realizes it's her. She is the Insurrecto. They are the women she's been working with. The plot that she's responsible for in your story, which is sheer magic.
The plot, of course, is a double meaning. You have the plot outside, you have their actual plot, their conspiracy, and the whole concept. Again, here's another thing about the Philippines. The war is often told through the Manila perspective, because Manila is the center, was the center of the Katipunan of the revolutionary movement. But these are people in the provinces, and it's always seen as if the people in the provinces were moved by Manila plotters. And I'm thinking, no, these people are moved because they were goddamn oppressed. They weren't told by people. And so this concept that the revolutionary consciousness is in the actual people, that organic revolution. And I do think that the Philippine Revolution was organic. I think we have to see it in the ways in which the body was moved.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even the fact that your rice was burned as a military tactic. It's that you were told you had to burn it. You burn your rice. So I think in that very embodied, very material way, you make that clear. I mean, there's many heartbreaking moments in your novel. And now it is a novel that it's in love with language. There's moments in it of incredible joy. Even, in the lushness of the scenery, when Magsalin and Chiara go on their journey, I really wanted to be there. There's moments of tremendous joy, but there's also moments of tremendous heartbreak. And Cassiana's father, the treatment of her father, that was heartbreaking. It was one of many such. They're small moments. You don't dwell on them, but they accumulate, and there is that sense of oppression. As being, I mean, it sounds now like a cliche, a lived experience, but there is, even in the reader, there's that sense of it being incredibly daily, and yet explosively there, that it requires a violent act to get it off, to get out from underneath it. And I think the imprisonment of the men of the town, of Balanyaga, shoot me if I get it wrong again, okay?
No.
The point you made a little bit earlier about the fossilization of language, I want to come back to that if it's all right with you, the way in which certain terms get bleached of where they came from, bleached of their meaning, and yet stay, and sometimes generate new terms, the way in which Geronimo becomes here something different. I mean, there is parallels with the history of English in Ireland. When I was growing up, I remember in school, we were taught to speak English in a way that bleached out some of the ways in which Gaelic had survived. And one of those ways that was a particular way of pronouncing E-A. So you didn't have a cup of tea, you had a cup of tea. You didn't have feet, you had fate. You didn't eat meat, you ate mate. And that was frowned upon as not proper English. So you would, but it always struck me, and it wasn't until later I realized it, that was in Shakespearean plays, that was the pronunciation of A, because the settler colonists, when they arrived in Ireland, they brought with them the English from their period, and then Ireland was cut off from trade. So the language just stayed in a way that it didn't, with the vowel sound shifted in England. And I'm wondering how you, I was going to say cope with, but you're a magician. I think coping sounds too passive, but how you managed to make that the layers of language that you work with, how did you manage not just to make them your own, but to not hate some of the language that you're using?
I love the fact that you're bringing up the Irish, because, you know, as a Filipino, one of the, okay, this is like for me a really powerful learning moment was that moment in Portrait of the Artist, where you have that, he's working with that term tundish. I don't know if you know that moment in James Joyce, and it's the way tundish is heard by the priest, by, you know, and the English tundish, you know, and just the, and then there's the centering of, because I think Joyce, for me, was very interesting that he has all of these, he has a whole of Western Europe in his arsenal, but he centers the Irish. You know, he centers not just the Irish, he centers obviously him, he centers the Dubliners. But for me, learning from that, it's not really just learning from Joyce, but it's just growing up in the province, because I'm not a Manila person, and so having those layers of kind of powers over you, but I don't know what it is, centering your own world. So this novel and all of my novels do center the world in which I grew up, which was an outlier world, a world outside of the power structures, but which I recognize were, if you understood this world, you would understand much more powerfully the history of this country, a history of Asia, a history of colonization, a history of imperialism, a history of capitalism that would be, you know, that you could be blind to, even if you were a Manileño, because Manila is so you know, the power lies in Manila people. So I think that's what it is, centering what you know, knowing very well that others are blind to it. And so that's how I think about language, that the blindness of others is really a power for me, because it allows me to really work with the reader. So the reader is very important to me.
Yeah, it was one thing I was going to say, because that centering your own world, or how their world appears to you from your place, there is a tremendous sense of you being massively at home, you know, in 1901, in the 1970s, and now. But you're also very kind to your reader. And that's not, I think, in particular for what we think of as literary fiction, you know, fiction that has ambitions, not just to tell the story, but as you say, to draw attention to the way in which the story is told. Quite often, they're not hostile places for a reader, but they're cold. You know, you're kept at a distance. So again, I find it, I would be very interested to know, when you're writing, who is the reader? Do you write to them, to her, to a nationality, or to even a time?
I would say I'm thinking about those characters. But when I think about, let's say, a character who was very troubling for me, Chiara was very troubling for me. Cassandra Chase was very troubling for me. Like Cassandra Chase, for instance, trying to figure out that woman, the white woman in that 1901 world, who also was oppressed in some ways by her time being a woman, but then she comes to the Philippines and she's not going to be able to see Casiana Nacionales for who she is. She's not going to be able to see the Filipinos for what they're doing. She's going to have an empathy. She's going to have a way of seeing that will be somewhat better, that somewhat more interesting, being an artist, because she's an artist, than, let's say, the white soldier. But so you can see all the different ways that you needed to see Cassandra Chase. And so for me, when I'm thinking about kindness, and I thank you very much for saying that, because I really worked hard on trying to understand these characters, but at the same time, have my readers recognize, you know, you can't be as blind as Cassandra Chase. You can't replicate their blindness. So, but understand Cassandra Chase and her position in 1901, being the bearers of violence, actually. The term that one scholar called these women photographers that, as in their term, domesticated imperialism with tender violence, the tender violence of these women photographers. So there's the I'm looking at the character, but the character is in a world. So the character is completely part of that material world that does not include only 1901, but us now, includes all the different ways that we could look at that character. At the same time that she has to be real in her world. And that is where I'm thinking about the reader being able to recognize that kind of layered history in which all of us exist, not just Cassandra Chase, but all of us exist. When we exist right now in this point in time, and you're talking about the Irish, I'm talking about the Filipinos, there is a simultaneity of these worlds, for me anyway, that's useful for us to see.
Yeah. I mean, that simultaneity, I think, is what I was gesturing towards when I got that sense of that each moment in the novel seems saturated with each other moment, and the saturation it doesn't stem from any one of the characters. They belong in their moments, and they're very persuasive. They're very compelling. I found, I don't know whether I should admit this, but even Randall's, that Randall's, I should say, is one of the soldiers who is there, one of the American soldiers who's there in 1901, and I might come back to Randall's actually, because it would be a way. There's just a couple of sentences I'd like to read to capture something of the way in which, Gina, you can do a huge amount of work in a very, very short space, with very, very few words. But before I do that, I wonder, would it be useful for those who are listening just to hear a little bit more about Cassandra Chase, because Cassandra Chase and Chiara have that they're both white, both Americans, and both wealthy, and the ways in which you handle them, I think it's very, very important. But if we take maybe Cassandra Chase and that passage that we were talking about, and you could maybe read here yourself from the Cassandra Chase chapter that begins with the description of her camera. I think it's stereoscope. Mm-hmm. I have it at, or stereo vision. My apologies, stereo vision. So I don't. If you're in that chapter as well, and if it's okay with you, Gina, I think maybe to do a page and a bit is. I'm sure just to let. We've been speaking about the novel. And to bring it home, I think, to actually hear you read some of it would be great. So, how to focus given her distance, sitting as she did on the veranda of the itinerant Governor General's home. So that's a question that's sitting in a paragraph on its own. So maybe to read to there or further, if you think it would be useful.
That would be good. I'm just going to also show you what a stereoscope looks like. Looks like this.
Oh.
Okay, so here's a stereoscope, and what you would do is, so here is here's the kind of photograph that she would do. I don't know. So this is a stereo card, and if you had the hardbound version of Insurrecto, my publisher was very, very nice to create end papers that had these cards. So this is the double vision. And what you do with the stereoscope is you look into it and you move it and you have like stereo vision until it's like stereo vision. So you just move it until you it's very close. It's a very intimate photograph. And I found a lot of them at the Library of Congress when I was first doing research on this novel. I didn't know what they were, but I was really fascinated. And I ended up buying a lot on eBay because at the time you could actually do that. They're very expensive right now, but at the time they weren't. So stereo vision. Her camera is the size of her largest hat box, carried by the young Francisco, the captain's 10-year-old servant, the orphan. This is, by the way, on page 232 if you have the text. The photographic lenses are borne separately by solemn adolescents awed by their charge, and they walk the way their fathers carry, San Lorenzo Martir's Caromata, in the town's yearly fiesta parade, following an invisible line in lockstep. Her porters carry her goods around as she wanders the town, eyes alert to its possible compositions. Both aesthetic and pathetic fallacies cloud her judgment. She does not notice the lack of toddlers or their mothers in the dirt yard. The only women are a few old cooks with those staunch peasant calves and bowed heads, and her young friend from her last visit, Cassiana Nacionales, the lively trader and church lector, now also her hostess. Cassandra notices the numerous pigs out for slaughter who could not, but it is, after all, the day before fiesta, so Cassiana tells her, Víspera San Patron. Cassandra Chase has no calendar on her, Butler's Lives of the Saints or the Catholic Missal, to check the feast day of the patron, St. Lawrence of Rome, San Lorenzo Martir, a date that falls in August, not September 28. So fate escapes her vision. She notices instead the tranquility of the suffering workers in the heat. What strikes her in her tours about the country is that everything is heartbreaking, and yet she thinks art designed. This is cruel. The laborers who look like medieval martyrs, she cannot help her art-damaged perception, are exactly like the suffering figures of supernatural calm that she had studied in the churches and museums during her grand tour of Florence, Venice, and Rome. On one hand, she would prefer that the horror she witnesses throughout these islands be only what it is, a gross injustice, but even the burning of the towns in central Luzon by a man she would call Lucifer if she had a pulpit, even the terrible flames of the mahogany forests and Arthur MacArthur's scorched Luzon were a technical problem of vanishing perspective. How to focus, given her distance, sitting as she did on the veranda of the itinerant Governor General's home. For a month or so, she had volunteered to take pictures of the islands as Governor William H. Taft made his inspections of the subdued towns. Her camera's eye was a curse.
That is great, Gina. Thank you. The moments there that you used the phrase art damage perception, I almost felt rebuked. You know, was I seeing the events in your novel in terms of the beauty of the writing? You know, was I too not noticing the absence of the women, or seeing, you know, workers in terms of the tranquility of how they appeared rather than the suffering involved in their sweat? So I'm going to ask you just to speak about your own approach to literature, and in particular literature that it is ambitious historically, that wants to tell a story in ways that enlighten us about history. And do you worry at all about pushing those stories into fiction? Do you worry that the writing and hence the reading of them becomes about something other than the people who are involved?
Absolutely. You know, I'm not worried about the fact of putting them into writing, that one should do that, and one should do that political work in some way, or one should do this work that provokes the reader to try to think a lot more ethically and powerfully about this history. Here's what I worry. I worry about myself, you know. I worry about my own, you know, you're living in a world where you're recognizing, you know, your own attachments to art, your own attachments to books, your own attachments to words and all of these things. And that I think about that a lot as a writer, and that interrogation of myself and how to read art that I have that's really ingrained in me. I was telling Michael this, I grew up a Maoist, the Philippine Communist Party is Maoist. So the Philippine university that I went to was very saturated with Maoist thought. And it's Maoist because it's the country's semi-feudal, really. So the industrialization of the country is really not so powerful. So it really is correct to think, from the countrysides into the cities and think about the farmers, etc. And so the work that one does as a student where I was growing up was really criticism, self-criticism. Who are you? What is your subject position? How does your own status, your own place in the world work with the current conditions of the country, et cetera, et cetera. So as a young writer, really, I think I really still truly think about the political ways of thought of my peers at the university when I was 16 years old. It's very strong in me, but I loved art. So and for me, for me, your questions about Adorno, I love those questions. But this way of where I understand that the way that the reader is part of art. That's how I understand this way of the complications of this art damaged perspective. The art damaged perspective. It's actually a self-criticism that I have of my own self in some ways. But it is also the fact that we tend not to see always. It's constant in our in the dialectic, in the kind of conversations that we have about books, representation, et cetera, et cetera. The reader is part of art. We always kind of don't see that how we're responding to it is part of the art, and that the writers are also thinking about the best writers, Shakespeare, etc. They are thinking about the reader and how the reader is taking in their work, and so for me, the reader is very much part of that a way of working through my work. So for instance, when I say here, her camera's eye was a curse, I'm doing double there. So her camera's eye was a curse for her in this part, she could be thinking about that herself, Cassandra Chase. Her camera's eye was a curse also for Cassiane, because the response of Cassiane is, but your position is worse, don't you think, as Cassiana Nationalis, the traitor, that time she met her in Hippodlos. What do you mean, asked Cassandra? Surely your position as the governor's guest, going along with his masquerade of peace, is a worse thing than your eye for art, So there's also your camera's eye is a curse for Cassiana Nationalis. And then I'm addressing the reader as well, who's reading this, and as you're saying, you're going, okay, is my eye also a curse? Am I also seeing this? So there are multiple layers, even in that sentence, and I'm very aware of that as a writer. I'm just very aware that language has multiple opportunities for reflection and multiple ways of being interpreted, just because it is language.
I think in particular when what you're doing with language is recalling suffering or telling a story of suffering, that there are dangers that it becomes a spectacle. I mean, the dystopia project that Michael mentioned, I've been reading a lot of dystopias, and the amount of imagination and energy expended on imagining catastrophes, it makes me think that the entirety of history, the unfolding in particular of the last couple of 100 years, was a catastrophe. It could only be a bourgeois society that invents a genre that says the worst thing is yet to come. Because in many ways, if our fiction was geared towards the past, I think we'd have a far better chance of understanding ourselves. But writing about the past it does open up questions in particular about perception, and the way in which, I think, again, when you were speaking about Manila as the center and how to dislocate that, so as to have the confidence to speak about where you are, that in order to dislocate the perceptions of others, a certain violence has to be done. And I think that's why sometimes ambitious fiction can appear cold or distant, because it's doing a lot to undermine where the reader's coming from, perhaps necessarily, and something that you don't have to do, but perhaps because you take your time with the reader. I mean, the figure of Chiara, if we move to her from Cassandra, and this might be the last question I put to you, because I think we've just gone beyond the 40 minutes. So those who are listening, we'll let them in. They'd be very, very welcome to ask a question. But if we just, Chiara is a filmmaker and the daughter of a filmmaker, and that carries on. I hesitate to call it a theme because it's too multi-layered and too open, but let's call it a theme for the sake of just time, about the reproduction of reality, the stereo vision, the stereoscope, and then onto film itself, and the film, the unintended, the film that in the novel is called The Unintended, and then the film that Chiara wants to make. How different is Chiara's position as an artist from that of Cassandra Chase?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I really had to grapple with Chiara. I mean, she actually in the original version, I didn't have all of those chapter ones, so this novel has like, I don't know how many chapter ones, but in the original version, that road trip was not part of my original novel. The second part of the novel was just, here's one film, here's another film, here's one. And so there was no breathing space. And my editor said, let's figure out how to have some breathing space. And so there's a lot more of Chiara. And so I recognize my lack of interest in really expanding on Chiara. Chiara versus Cassandra. Cassandra is very much of that period, so it's easier to step back from Cassandra because she is, so you can think about her as a Victorian woman of a particular time and, put her in that kind of portraitscape. But Chiara is contemporary. So Chiara is actually a figure of the contemporary reader, and contemporary ways of thinking about representation. And I have huge quarrels with concepts of representation. But anyway, so I really had to have that kind of very both nuanced as well as particular ways of having Chiara be understood. For instance, I had to write and rewrite that karaoke scene, the final scene, where they're explaining their different choices as so-called writers of these scripts. And I have Cassandra Chase just say to her right off, I had Magsalin just say right off to Chiara, I included Cassandra Chase because otherwise you wouldn't read the script if the white woman weren't there. So the figure of the white woman is definitely a figure for the reader, and a very deliberate political move in terms of thinking about the erasure of brown voices in American political fiction. In American fiction, not even political, just American fiction, and the concept of American fiction that politics shouldn't be part of, and this whole stupid world of American bourgeois fiction where if you're being political, it's kind of wrong. So she's very much a trope that is addressing the contemporary reader, whereas Cassandra is, I read a lot of books about Victorian women and by Victorian women. So very different kind of timescapes, I guess.
Yeah, I just, before I hand over to the audience members, I should say that, and again, I think this is part of your generosity towards the reader, the novel is punctuated with moments where I can go off and Google something.
Yeah.
So even praxino.com comes up as praxino.org. I might put the link into the chat, actually,
yes,
for you're interested. And I only found it today. when I was doing the script for the session. But there are such magnificent nuggets on that prexino.org. You make a teacher's job very, very easy. I'd like to thank you separately for that. I'll go get the link and put it up. And while I'm doing that, let's turn it over to the audience and see if there's anybody who would like to put a question to Gina.
Could I say something? Because you had mentioned the epigraph, and in terms of your concept of the kindness to the reader, the way the reader is enfolded in the text. And I do think that the epigraph by Eric Gamalinda, which comes from his book of poems, Amigo Warfare. Amigo Warfare was the very first book where I heard that term, and I didn't know what it was about, but it was a term that Filipinos had for their warfare against the Americans, where they were both friends to the Americans, and then they would turn back and go, okay, I'm going to tell the revolutionaries what's going on with these Americans. So this Amigo Warfare book of poems by Eric, and this concept, grief is a nation of everyone, and that kind of allowing the reader to move into the text, because everyone does have a space of, a space of lack that may drive one to imagine others. And I think that maybe is where I also think about, if you're thinking about the kindness that I have and the ways in which I try to avoid, I really do, it is really actually part of my work. I'm very, trying to avoid re-traumatizing, given the trauma that I'm writing about, because if you think about this war, there was a lot of rape, there was a lot of, but I refused to re-traumatize the readers by doing another rape scene, etc. To be honest, in Filipino literature, especially Anglophone Filipino, the ones in English, there's a lot of use of rape as the metaphor for the nation. And I absolutely hate that shit, Yeah. I find that very troubling.
It's lazy. Apart from it's politically, it's lazy.
Yeah, it is incorrect. So I refused. And to be honest, rape certainly was part of Balangiga, but I just refused to make that the center of the story. Instead, it was women warriors. That's the center of Balangiga.
I wonder if it's such a beautiful excerpt. I wonder, would you read it? I'm going to apologize to the audience, but I just do think it goes around and around in my head, those first two lines, grief is a nation of everyone. So I think if you would maybe read it, please.
He's a beautiful poet. He's the best, I think he's the best contemporary poet of Filipinos, Eric Gamalinda. Grief is a nation of everyone, a country without borders. I roam the avenues of it out of habit. Summoned to testify on everyone's behalf, I'm sticking to my story. It's better not to talk about the wounded or the moist remains of the disappeared, but there's always one who can tell in the packed amplitude of crowds. We are so many bodies, my friends. We all move in the same direction, as though someone had a plan. That's from DMZ.
Yeah, and it is beautiful. I mean, I don't know if it's a push, but that as though someone had a plan has a kind of a secret hope in it. I think there's the incredible sadness, but also that small utopian charge, as though someone had a plan. It is beautiful, and congratulations on choosing it for your novel. It worked incredibly well. So I think we will. I've just seen that Michael has written in the chat to if guests would write stack in the chat, or you can use your hand. Feel free to do either. Okay, we have Alana. Would you like to?
Sure, I have. I read your novel. It was sort of the final novel in this literature group that we did at the end of last year, and I don't have it up in full disclosure. Michael and I are partners, so he's actually in another room and I'm downstairs. So and I think he has Insurrecto upstairs with him. But I do remember the epigram, and I remember pointing it out to our readers at the time. And we read your book, the novel, right after reading Happiness by Amanita Forna, which seems like a very, it's a very different book. However, that epigram really spoke to a part of that novel, which was very interesting to me, was about PTSD and trauma, which main character in that, one of the main characters in that novel, who is works with trauma victims, was like, you have to deal with grief. You have to deal with the grief, or you will never heal. And that the sort of suppression of that idea within the, at least the way it was depicted in that novel, in the sort of psychological community of psychotherapists and such. So I remember that quite clearly. And then I have a couple of like little scattershot comments. I think your novel was one of the most challenging and complex novels, pieces of literature that I've read, and it was very layered. It was hard structurally. The way, it was like this sort of post-modernist, the way that the multiple repeating of chapter numbers throughout, the book and that kind of thing. So it made it hard, I think, for a lot of readers, but it was really well worth the effort, and I encourage anybody who hasn't read it to do so. I remember thinking at the time about that whole stereo vision, that sort of that it was a metaphor for the way the doubleness of seeing history, of recording history. But I'm just curious about what you meant when you just mentioned earlier, what you meant by saying that you have quarrels with concepts of representation. Did you mean that by other artists, or the way Chiara in the book, or generally, or just how I thought that was a very nice way of putting it, but I'm not exactly sure what you were.
Yeah, it's just there's just a constant. It seems to me that this concept that having like a Filipino superhero out there, or having a Hispanic Disney movie is good. Just this very flat concept of the political desire for seeing yourself in art, in popular media, etc. And I do think that sometimes it obscures the fact that having a Filipino superhero in Marvel comics, or whatever it is that they do, since I don't even watch them, evades the responsibility of actual political transformation, actual political responsibility towards the Filipinos in America, or towards the Hispanic world, issues of equality that actually are beyond simple, representations in Hollywood movies. And again, I think the issue there lies in the fact that the passivity of the reader, which I think is one of the ways in which I think about, I thought about how to work on this novel. The passivity of the reader is one of the I guess knots, KNOT, knots of representation, knots of art that I'm working with, and sometimes demanding representation just makes the passivity of the reader much more pronounced.
So you just said that Chiara was somebody that you didn't really care about that much, maybe, but did she have a transformative understanding about representation, about her father's film at the end of the book, or no?
I don't know. For me, that would be up to the reader. That would be a reader question for the reader to think about. But she's definitely a figure that the reader needs to confront, in terms of, especially as this was a published in the United States, you have there that white reader that Chiara is, and you think about her in terms of the screen for that kind of reader. But I have to say this. I absolutely agreed with my editor that I could not have a flat Chiara. I couldn't have a Chiara that in the end I couldn't see, that I was also blind to as the writer. And so that was a lot of work that I did to make myself see Chiara, what was going on with her. She's actually a pivotal witness to one of the incidents of trauma that I actually also had I included it. It was the Duterte war crime of one of the Duterte fascist police people.
Right.
And so she's the witness of that, and I made her the witness of that because it allowed having the outsider witness this atrocity, allowed the portrayal of the atrocity to be expressed, in an explicit way. Whereas if I were a Filipino looking at that, a Samareño, a person from Balangiga looking at that, that would be in my view, it would be written very differently. It would be written with, blood in the eye, as opposed to the woman who's wearing her wedge sandals, et cetera, et cetera. So it allows a different kind of seeing. And Chiara, I gave her that witness to kind of move her into the theme of blood. But so she did various things. She did various things. She allowed the witness, but she also became part of the story. I had to figure out how to move in her body. And I think it's really important for an artist that you kind of also, and it's part of the weird work of art, to occupy the body. I couldn't be separate from Chiara as well as a writer.
It's a question I've pondered as well. That question that was asked about was there a transformative moment or phase for Chiara? And I think the fact that she never goes to Balangiga. I'm going to ask you, Gina, just to read a passage from the chapter. She rides along the coast towards a historic, and even there, the sentence doesn't get to where it's going to go, because I think that moment, Duterte's Philippines is there most vividly, most violently in that moment, and it is Chiara that you give witnessing to. So I think it might be useful, and apologies to Mary, I'll come back to Mary's question, but it might be useful for us to hear that section. So it's page 222 or chapter 1. She rides along the coast towards a historic in my version. It'll be a little bit later, I think, in the hardback.
Do you want me to start at the beginning? She has more.
I think just again that the luggage, it's a beautiful. Yes, please.
She has more armed guards than she has luggage. She has a sense of purpose even Magsalin admires. She rides along the coast toward a historic place, and by simply stepping on its soil, she will accomplish her duty, an homage to the dead, but not only for her benefit. Films, after all, have a sociality not even the most narcissistic can subvert. They require the possibility of observers. Thus, consumers are significant to her story. For an inland riverine town, this coastal road is invigorating. So much of this journey seems to be a start. Holiday goers pass by in a rented vehicle toward a surfer's beach, advertised also on a store. Then there is a truckload of rice sacks and pigs. A child sucking on a lollipop on the back of her father's motorcycle waves cheerfully at the tinted Pajero. She has a frilled dress, a book bag, and curly hair. Chiara waves back, but that is so dangerous. To put your kid on a motorbike on the highway without a helmet. The father shouts at the kid to hold tight, Chiara thinks. Chiara holds on to the door handle as the Pajero jolts at the sound of the shots. Two policemen on motorcycles riding in tandem rev past them. First it is a goat that appears on the road, then a pig. The Pajero twists and turns out of the way of the corpses. Then it stops. What are you doing, Gogo boy? We don't stop here, says Chiara. For a moment she is afraid. She will not believe what she will witness. I'll continue. She hears but does not see the men behind them, also on motorbikes, pulling alongside the Pajero. There is an inconsiderate lapse between vision and hearing that angers Chiara, as if injustice lies in the syncope or some sound mixer were off duty. She keeps feeling sensory gaps. The tape keeps being advanced to the wrong moments, so that the bad cuts have the effect of miscommunicating the scene's pathos. The sounds of the motorcycles before them are already erased, unheard, and there is no wailing at the sight of the bodies. Her gaping mouth is silent. It is no pig or goat. It is the mangled length of a father and child.
I think it's through, I mean, there is no other scene like that, but it is through the way you write, the layering and the returning and returning and returning, that Chiara becomes real. You know, the moment when Magsalin meets her in Ali Mal, she appears, you know, to be monotone, opaque, and then she fills in, I think, but it is over time. And I am not sure, as readers, do we know if her film is going to be the one that's made, because I know I don't want it to be made. I want Magsalin's film to be made. So Mary, apologies, I cut in.
Please. When I finished Insurrecto, I was just left silent, and that doesn't often happen with me with a book. So I think I felt it deeply. I also want to thank you for bringing me closer to the Philippines, which I knew so little about, although I have been acquainted with many Filipino people and have worked with closely with a Filipino man, and yet I knew so very little, had such a lack of any concrete sense of the Philippines. So just thank you very much for that. And before I have any questions, I need to reread your very layered, complex book. And thank you for being here today and for the book.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much for your comment.
I wonder then, could I maybe return to Alana's point as well, because what I kept on thinking when I was reading some of the interviews, Gina, that you had given, including the one in The Believer, which is, I think, a really, really useful one. But it's one where you describe, I'm going to read this actually, you describe your relationship with English. So your novels so far have been published in English. And you write there about using English. I'm going to quote, "I do not see it as a problem or not a personal one. Our multiple languages are our form of existence, deep and mired in Filipino reality. As the translators, the wordplay in my novels call attention to the fact." And it seemed to me that there's a relationship between your approach to language there, that you own it, you know, that actually, let me strike that. It's not that you own it. You're refusing that notion that culture, like language, is something that is owned. It's something that is used rather than owned. So your use of Elvis Presley and your use of Muhammad Ali, all the different ways in American popular culture is present in the Filipinos, means not so much even that it's de-Americanized, but that its meaning becomes dependent on its use rather than where it's from. So all the arguments that people have about appropriation, about cultural appropriation, they're all transformed by that notion. If you refuse the notion of ownership, of property in culture and in language, it frees you up then to be much more free in your approach to it. And I think maybe the same thing for representation.
Yeah, it frees you as an artist when you refuse this, I think I would say, kind of this, I don't know how you would say that, bourgeois capitalist notion of purity. There's this concept of owning anything,
Yeah.
Owning culture, et cetera, et cetera. So not that you don't recognize when a cultural artifact or something might actually be traumatizing or oppressive for you, but you do recognize that as well. But the fact that how you use them, the reader in the text, the reader in Elvis, the reader in Muhammad Ali, the person who reads, the person who takes it in and figures out what to do, what it might mean. If you're using it in a way that allows greater freedom, that allows a liberatory world in you, then that's different. It's a different way of taking in that figure. So so I think that's really kind of key to the way that I think about the use of English in my text, because I will use a Filipino language when I need to. I will. My next novel actually has a lot of what-I in it. It has the most what-I in it that I've ever used. But I use English without apology. I mean, I use English, as I said, I'm not the one who colonized.
Yeah.
I'm not the one who violated the country. It is actually up to the American citizen who does not understand why I use English. It's a problem. It's a problem when you don't know your own history. So the use of English for me lies in the fact that it's always been part of an arsenal. All language is part of the arsenal of the artist to figure out how to move in the world without apologizing for the way you exist in it, at the same time that the way you exist in it should not be another form of exploitation. So recognizing the translated quality of all of our uses of language allows me to be freer in my use of English in my work. That's what I would probably.
We need to get you a column in a British newspaper. The novelist Lionel Shriver, I mean, I like her novels. She's incredibly mean, and sometimes I like reading mean.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But she, as a person, that her political views are incredibly obnoxious, and she's very anti what she calls political correctness around cultural appropriation. She says, if I want to have a character who's a Mexican, I'm going to have a character because that's my right as an artist.
Is this a narcissistic concept of the figure, a narcissistic concept of language, the ego as being so central to it? Whereas what I'm saying is that if you recognize that the ego is a fantasy, is a fantastical object that we use in some way to survive, in some way to be ourselves. But if we're always constantly recognizing that ego is completely constructed and is an aspect of illusion, we might have a more powerful way of thinking about that Mexican that you want to use in your goddamn novel.
And it is something that we do need to think about and grapple with, because there's a generation of students. And for them, in all goodness, they do not want to get it wrong. So when they're discussing a novel, there's a character of color. They think, well, I can't. I can't have anything to say. Of course it is. But if the only voices that are saying that's stupid are coming from the Lionel Shrivers of the world, we're in trouble. Then we're in trouble.
But like that's why I like the concept that you have this Marxist education project, because I do think that when one thinks in this way, which is a lot more about the structures, the economic structures, as opposed to the individual, the ego way of thinking about art, etc., you might have a much more powerful way of thinking about representation and so-called, I don't even know what this appropriation is, because appropriation really does mean having ownership. Like like I'm a Filipino and I have ownership about my being Filipino. No, I don't have ownership, but I think there are better ways of reading the Philippines, there are better ways of reading. So yeah, I understand. I actually really do push back on my own students about that issue. Because when you say that you have empathy, but you can't be the one, you can't imagine being Black, like, fuck you. You have to try. The imagination is really powerful. And I think what we have to have is a deeply ethical imagination, a deeply, deeply kind of interrogating, disturbed, troubled imagination.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that's the only way for any sort of writing to hope to have a purchase, to have a grasp of the world we're in. I mean, the use of Elvis by the uncles, Magsalin's uncles in Manila, I really hope that you write about them some other time, because the uncles are brilliant, and their karaoke with Elvis. It's just a fantastic way. I mean, democratize isn't the right word here, but I'm going to use it. It's just a fantastic way to show this is how culture gets used. These are not people who are the objects of the soft imperialism of American cultural power. These are people who are getting a tremendous kick out of singing Elvis songs in their back room or their sitting room or something on whatever night that is, that fantastic scene that finishes the novel.
That's the thing about the double reading that I'm thinking about. They make Elvis relevant.
Yeah.
Their singing of Elvis makes Elvis relevant. And it's not the fact of Elvis being Elvis. It's the fact that for some reason Elvis entered them, and now Elvis becomes interesting, because why are these, provincial Filipino men so taken by this man in costume who has costumed himself in this very weird, fantastical way, but used Black music? So and again, Elvis himself for me is not the problem, but the capitalist reader of the way in which Elvis was used by the capitalist recording industry to kind of the misrecognition of Black suffering and trauma in the Elvis in Elvis's use of rock and roll. Elvis himself was very clear about, this is Black music, and not to say that, that's also not problematic, but I'm just saying it makes you think about Black history.
It does.
And you think Black history and its effect on global affect, that these Filipinos are hearing Black music through Elvis, through this misrecognition of themselves in Elvis, and there's just this constant, interesting, cyclical, spiraling piece that culture can be.
But this is, and again, it's so beautifully done and so sharply done, but at the same time, it is complex. The way that you write about their use of Elvis, there's a whole theory of culture, and it's not a theory of representation, it's a theory of use. And this is how meaning gets made.
Use value versus, exchange value. I mean, that's what it is. It's about the fact that it still has a use value, and we keep forgetting that. We keep forgetting that everything that's in the world has multiple values, and when we only see it as exchange value, then we're fucked. But if we see the use and how it can make these it does different things to different people.
It's not as shiny, it's not as packaged, it's much messier. But just because of that, there's a truth and an integrity to it, no matter how chaotic.
Funny. I thought it was very funny as a child.
And it was funny. It was funny. I mean, these very masculine men, and I could just imagine the gyrations as well as the singing that would be accompanying them. So
also, they were very good singers.
Fantastic scene. So, Michael, my apologies. You've had your
not long. I wasn't there long at all. And this Elvis discussion brings me to two places. One is your very first paragraph, Gina, in chapter 20, which, if we go long enough, I'll get back to the chaptering question later in today, but where you say, for the mystery writer, it is not enough to mourn the dead. One must also study the exit wounds, invite the coroner to tea, cloud the mind with ulterior motives. And I didn't even realize what I was reading when I opened the book and went through it. But then when this event was coming up, I had this whole thing I designed around that paragraph, but never got around to doing it. But it brings me over to what were the ulterior motives of the collage I put together to promote that put Coppola. I didn't get Oliver Stone in the collage, but what were the ulterior motives of Coppola and Oliver Stone telling their anti-imperialist story about Vietnam in an imperial way, in the Philippines in a certain way? And that I don't think that the way you represented this was in any way a mechanical way. There was something about the way they came in that was tied into the stereo vision from earlier in 1901. It's tied in with the 70s, but in another way, Stone and Coppola, to me, in the end, seem part of the detritus of the Patricia pointed out when I brought up Suspicious Minds, that there was also the Eagles tape cassette stuck in the cassette player. There is this detritus that the Coppolas and Oliver Stones leave behind in their wake after they go in and make this big cultural production and then leave. And I think they're in some ways unconscious of their equivalent imperial manner of that is in some ways allies with Howling Wilderness Smith. And I'm not asking a question, I'm just putting some of this out there.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And again, I think there's again that doubleness. So for the Filipino, with the mixtapes and with the Betamax machines and all of that, whatever Coppola and Stone think about themselves, whatever Elvis even thinks about himself, for the Filipinos, that's who they are. They're like these people that you're going to put in this kind of tape and, leave there in this dust, in the mold there. And so it is detritus. It is capitalist detritus. And, even if the Filipino is not going to say it that way, that is how that's how they remain. That's how they kind of exist in that piece. At the same time, when I say ulterior motives, for me, I bring that in. I ask the reader to think about that, but I'm not going to be the one to tell the reader what is the ulterior motive. In fact, I will give the reader space to think about it another way, to see if there's another way to look at Coppola and Stone. Now, here's the thing about me watching Apocalypse Now. So I had a lot of friends who were actually in Apocalypse Now. They were like dead bodies, or I don't know what they were doing in Apocalypse Now. But there's a whole genre of Filipino, art people in the Philippines who had something to do with Apocalypse Now. Now, I watch it when I'm older again, and one of the triggers for doing this novel. And I was really struck by the fact that Coppola in the 70s created these beautiful scenes of the river, of the Filipino countryside that was just about me, about my, oh my God, I'm thinking, oh my God, that is 1976. I remember 1976. So he's making it seem like it's Vietnam. I'm reading it as my childhood. I'm looking at the river. I'm looking at the coconut trees. I'm looking at the vista, and for me, it's just my childhood, because that's 1976, and that's around the time that I was becoming more conscious of my environment. And so you can see the difference. That I would at the very least give Coppola that, again, the kindness, but it's not really. I would at least give Coppola the film, the fact that I'm receiving it and I'm receiving it as another way in which to enter my country. But the way I enter my country is that it is a stand-in for a violent occupation and invasion by the U.S. military that replicates what happened to my country in 1899 through 1913. So again, the layers there. I'm seeing the Vietnam of Coppola, but I'm seeing my actual childhood vista of rivers and coconuts.
Thanks. Patricia, iPhone is Jacqueline.
Oh, I was just going to say there is a question from iPhone, but it's a question from Jacqueline.
Right.
You want to work away, Jacqueline?
Okay. Thank you very much for this wonderful discussion, Gina. And I'm wondering, as I read the book, you know, there's so much about American culture in it, but you open with a poem by a Filipino poet. So I'm wondering, as I read it, what aspects of Filipino literary culture would it be influential to a writer like yourself, and which Americans would not be aware of, you know, because the Philippines does have a literary history and we're not aware of it. So when you were writing, how much were you writing with consciousness of, say, a earlier Filipino literary history, or were you writing very much in, say, an American type of literary history?
There's a very long, I mean, obviously the Philippines was colonized, was invaded and occupied and colonized from 1898 through 1946 and into, of course, into the current regimes, because until 1992, the Philippines had the two largest American bases outside of the United States. You know, so the wars of the imperial wars of Southeast Asia that the United States engaged in. The Philippines was very much part of that militarism. So it's very material, you know, that history of the United States and the Philippines in terms of that connection. Therefore, part of the war of the United States against the Philippines lay in the establishment of public schools, because that was part of the pacification of the country. Therefore, our educational system was produced by that war. I was taught in English. I was not allowed to speak my own language in the schools that I went to, and all Filipinos at that time, and even now, I think that's still happening. Although there's a lot more. It's actually you now do not have to only teach in English. At the time when I was growing up, you weren't allowed to speak my language in my school, in the classroom. You were fined for speaking my language. Therefore our curriculum was also American. I mean, I grew up, I can recite, you know, the Gettysburg, you know, four score and 20 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this nation a new continent, you know, whatever. So I Gettysburg Review, the Victorian poets, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Christina Georgina Rossetti, all of those things are just things that I memorized. So if you're talking about what Americans about the Philippine literary history and its connection to America, it is actually a very strong connection with the violence of America's, with simply the violence that America is, you know, the violence that America has wrought upon the world. Now, so there's a lot of Philippine literature in English. They're published in the States. Penguin Classics, for instance, has the work of Nick Joaquin, the work of Jose Garcia Villa, the work of Carlos Bulosan. Those are all part of the American kind of dominion, because those are all written during the time of American occupation. But they are very Filipino. I grew up with those texts. I grew up with Philippine literature in English, and I think Americans should read those too. There is also the country was kind of produced by a novel in Spanish called No Me Tangere, Touch Me Not, by Jose Rizal. So it's a weird country that instead of having someone like George Washington as your national hero, our national hero was a poet and a novelist. And his statue is in every single town in the Philippines. You will still see Jose Rizal's statue. It exists in every town. You go all over the country. And there are two figures that are going to be in the province, Rizal most of all, but sometimes you'll see Juan Luna. Juan Luna is an artist. He's a painter. So this history of literature and politics in the Philippines is very powerful. So those are some of the people. Jose Rizal's novels, very important in an understanding of culture and decolonization, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist. The Philippines obviously was the first country in Asia that prosecuted an anti-imperial war, and actually won. We won against Spain. So so those are a few names: Jose Rizal, Jose Garcia Villa. His father was actually the doctor of Aguinaldo, who was the president of the Philippines that went to war against America. And Nick Joaquin, they're all available. Carlos Bulosan, who was an American labor leader. So he was a Filipino who was very much a figure in early 20th century American labor circles, published in the New Yorker, et cetera, et cetera. So Carlos Bulosan, it's called America is in the Heart. Every American should read that. It's about, actually, in terms of Marxist Education Project, it is actually about labor organizing in Seattle, Alaska, California, and eventually he comes to New York, etc. But it is a beautiful text on labor organizing in America by a Filipino.
Okay, thank you very much.
Patricia just pointed out there's a theater in Toronto named after him.
Bulosan or Rizal?
Bulasan. It's a community theater run by Filipina activists in my city.
Bulosan was amazing because he's one of those, what Gramsci would call organic intellectual, coming completely from the farmers in the north of the Philippines, and he comes to the States and learns and becomes this writer. He becomes a New Yorker writer. He's published in the New Yorker and all of that. Again, he becomes, as happens a lot among writers of color at the time, he's accused of being a plagiarist, and then he loses a lot of shit. He was hounded as usual by the FBI, so he's one of those people who one of those artist organizers who was part of that era of being criminalized by the American government.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to suggest, in relation to Michael's question about the Vietnam War era films that tend to get made in the Philippines about these atrocities down the road. The Sympathizer, I know I listened to a discussion, Gina, that you had with Viet Thanh, and again, it really, really worked together. So I think the Sympathizer is a novel that is maybe a lot harsher in terms of what it says about the film. But thank you as well to Cynthia. No, it wasn't Cynthia. My apologies. I'm still seeing iPhone. Jacqueline. I'm sorry, Jacqueline. But thank you for that. That was a great question. I'm embarrassed that I hadn't already thought to say it, and I was taking down loads and loads of notes as well. And then I think it's Alana. You have a question.
So, it's funny. We did read in a previous we had in our I'm shilling for the MEP here, but in our previous literature group, we did spy novels, which surprised me how many people liked it. And one of the novels we read was The Sympathizer, because we always read books that are a little bit, unconventional in terms of the genre. But speaking of that, and I don't mean to be too New York Times book reviewish here or whatever, but I'm wondering if you have could tell us of any contemporary novelists that you really like writing right now.
I'm reading right now a book of essays by Elaine Castillo. She's Filipino-American. She wrote America is Not the Heart. So she is a response to Bulosan. But really she's writing about being growing up in California as a Filipino-American. She's writing, I just finished her book called How to Read Now, which again, Patricia, in terms of your question regarding Lionel Shriver, I think that is a really good book to think about this kind of a more engaged way of thinking about representation, appropriation, those issues. So Elaine Castillo, I've been, Sabina Murray, by the way, she's a writer I know, but she really delves into colonization, but through these other ways. She actually did a whole novel on Roger Casement and an artist that Roger Casement seemed to have been in love with or something. But she did it through a woman, the wife of the object of love of Roger Casement. It's called Valiant Gentleman. I like her very much. She also did Carnivore's Inquiry, which is really seemingly about art and these works of art in Western Europe, but it's actually about, again, colonization and the ways in which to read texts and the bodies of women in those histories. The woman is a cannibal, so that's good. It's excellent. Sabina Murray. I really like Eugene Lim. He does weird kind of. I guess you're doing the dystopian project. He does a lot of kind of meditations on capitalism through AI, artificial intelligence type things. Very short, very, very, for me, I find him very, really great to read. I do like a lot. I do like Paul Beatty a lot. I like Paul Beatty. I like Ishmael Reed, those kinds of writers, Percival Everett. So those are some writers I can think of right now that I've been
Lately, I've been reading Harry Kunzru because I've been interested in fascism, and I really, he doesn't write this kind of historical novel, but interestingly, his novel Gods Without Men also had this sort of the narrative was broken up in terms of time and stuff. It sort of reminded me a little bit of Insurrecto, although it had a completely different story. But anyway, I like him very much because he's political and because he's writing political novels in a way that's very literary, and I found.
Well, my novels are actually quite. They're different in their different ways. So there's one novel that's a bit more, I would say, straightforward. It goes from A to B a little bit more, and that's Gun Dealer's Daughter. Although there's a lot of also shifts in perspective in that one. And Bibliolepsy, of course, is just it's like an overnight read. So you read it overnight. It's like it. It's very.
I'll be That's what I do. I read literature because it gives me pleasure and keeps me entertained and also makes me think better. Yeah. I think.
No, Lana's not part of our Grundrisse class on Saturdays.
Yeah.
I wonder. I'm going to mention there as well counter narratives.
That's so beautiful.
I saw you refer to it. I hadn't heard of him, but I actually managed to find a copy of it today in Brighton. So
He's a Fitzcarraldo author.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to Fitzcarraldo. I forget the name of the guy who's in Jacques and Fitzcarraldo. And I said, you know what? I like your press just because you you published John Keane, and he was saying to me, so you really like John Keane. How can I get the British people to say, because it didn't, apparently it didn't pick up.
I hadn't heard of him. I mean, I'm embarrassed, but I'm not embarrassed.
He's the best American writer, in terms
John
of
Keane?
short story.
John Keane, yeah.
K-E-E-N-E?
K-E-E-N is how I have it.
K-E-N?
Yeah, John Keane, counter narratives. Again, the way he understands the layering of history and contemporary. He's so good.
I mean, I love the title as well, counter narratives.
Yeah,
I mean, just say it like it is.
Yeah, everything about it is like, yeah.
I wonder, we've come up against what I think is maybe the most important, not lesson in any pedagogical sense, but what I learned from Insurrecto was how fiercely writing can be political. And it reminded me of something I think I knew, but I'd let sink into my consciousness how little writing, contemporary writing, is political. I mean, you mentioned the Paul Beese's. There's an anger in Beese's writing, which I love, but there's not a lot of angry literature out there. So I want to ask you about that, about the relationship. I mean, you've used the phrase engaged a couple of times, and I'm going to use engaged alongside that, but I think of it in the older sense maybe of being a committed writer. So I want to ask you that question, but I want to put it alongside something that's been troubling me a lot. And I think the mention of John Keane here is useful, is how does a writer today find their reader? How do you find your people when we live in an age in which there has never been as much writing, there has never been as much publishing, and yet a magazine as beautiful as The Believer is finishing because it can't find its readers. Amazon is a publishing behemoth, and it's squeezing out, even though it's liberating certain people, it's allowing them write, it's also squeezing out not necessarily space for other people to write, but space for them to encounter their readers. So I'm going to put those two questions together: the state of the contemporary publishing industry, how do you find your reader? And also the question about politics and form, and being an engaged writer in a period which maybe it's shifting now, maybe it's becoming not more acceptable, but more powerful to be thought of as a committed writer. But it used to be you were put in a box. You know, you were a working class writer, you were a woman writer, a feminist writer, or even you're a Filipino writer. So maybe it is changing now, but they're the two I think that we might finish on.
In terms of finding a reader here, I mean, when Michael wrote me and I saw that his project was called Marxist Education Project, I just immediately say yes. So one thing is that you do need to recognize. I mean, you're writing to create. I know that I write in terms. I think about the book and the integrity of the book and how the book needs to be done according to its demands. And for me, the demands of the book include, in how the reader is part of my text, which creates actually a lot of what people were talking about, the complexity and the layers, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how do you find the reader? How do you make, I would say I just make my books, and the people who are interested in my books, I move into them. Like I'm not thinking about the machine. I'm not thinking about the business. I'm thinking about the person who's interested in this story. So that, when I have an agent, you can't be a novelist without an agent. You can be a poet without an agent, but you can't be a novelist without an agent. So I have an agent. I have an agent who's dealing with all the money stuff. But I do move my agent into thinking about who wants my book versus where is the money for the book. So that's just me and the way I think about it. How I find my reader, I go with the people who are interested in the book. Now, what's weird about that is, let's say for Insurrecto, which was, I would have thought it was my agent actually said, Gina, don't do this one. Norton will not, because Norton published my last novel, Gun Dealer's Daughter. Norton's not going to publish this one. And I said, well, then don't give it to Norton. Give it to someone else. Find the reader. but then this becomes the one where NPR talks to me, or this becomes the one where I talk to Brian Lehrer. It's like weird, you know. You would think that this would not be the one, but it was. So you never know, and you just move. You work with the integrity of your piece. I do think that I absolutely believe that the novel that has a commitment to the world around it, that does not that does not like bow to the commercial exigencies of whatever. You're not thinking about that. I think it always has a place. Integrity has a place. That's just what I think. And if I didn't believe in that, then it's a problem. And if you think about all of the books that have survived, if you think about the bestsellers of 1920s, 1940s, 1950s, and then the books that actually survived, it's kind of interesting to see the books that won the National Book Award. No one ever talks about those.
Yeah.
You think about that. So you think about the long game, and then you think about the integrity of your book, and then you keep moving, even your editor, to move into the space that you want them to be in. And they help me too. They give me another eye. They show me when I'm being blind. So you listen to that too. But in terms of the machine and thinking about where they are right now, certainly there's a lot of very kind of strong pressure on publishing to be so-called better, to think about the white supremacy that really is part of their gaze. And there will always be errors, there will always be mistakes, and you just keep pushing, you keep making things happen. I think that just as revolution, for me, the Philippine Revolution is ongoing. The revolution in publishing is ongoing. It's very tough. What Marx understood about capitalism is how absolutely ingenious it is.
Yeah, I mean it's
it is an amazing survivor. So we just need to keep working against it.
The Marxist literary critic Franco Moretti, he describes history is many things, but one of the ways he says it can be described as the slaughterhouse of literature. All those novels that were once read and lauded and celebrated and so on, and now are not read. That the history of literature is the history of not reading as much as it is the history of reading.
Well, Franco Moretti does bring up Rizal. He's one of the few European critics who absolutely brings up Rizal, and he brings up in his book Distant Reading, he brings up the fact that why is it that at this point in time we don't hear about Rizal, but this is what he was at this point in time, but then he's not really thinking about in the Philippines. Rizal is in every goddamn town plaza.
I don't know. I mean, James Joyce isn't in every town square in Ireland, but close enough. Close enough. Let me just. I'm going to read the passage that I sent you from Adorno, because I think Adorno is a great person with which to think these questions
he
about.
Loves Proust, and I am a lover of Proust. That's why I read it.
It might be a way as well for you to speak about if there. Some when we use complexity, when we use the word complexity to describe a novel, sometimes it can be a way of saying it's hard, it's difficult. And I think some of the reason why your novels are difficult, they're hard. You must slow down your reading when you're reading them. But one of the ways I think that, and in particular, the denial of certainty about where am I right now, and the denial of any sort of reconciliation that's harmonious at the end of it. Instead, you're left with some questions and some doubts. I think that Adorno caught that in a way that I think it might be useful for us to finish on. So apologies to anybody there who really doesn't like Adorno. I'd ask you to think again, but this is just, I think, a really good passage for Insurrecto. He's giving out about the ways in which difficulty is chastised. Difficulty is chastised in art and in literature. And he writes about the novels that he considers to be something negative epics, the Proust, the Joyce, Beckett. And he says, these are novels which are, and I quote, testimonials to a state of affairs in which the individual liquidates himself. These epics, along with all contemporary art, are ambiguous. It is not up to them to determine whether the goal of the historical tendency they register is a regression to barbarism or the realization of humanity. And many are all too comfortable with the barbaric. There is no modern work of art worth anything that does not delight in dissonance and release, but by uncompromisingly embodying the horror and putting all the pleasure of contemplation into the purity of this expression, such works of art serve freedom, something the average production betrays simply because it does not bear witness to what has befallen the individual in the age of liberalism. So I find that helpful in approaching your novel. I wonder, do you find it helpful in approaching that, the ambivalence, the dissonance that is in your writing?
Right, yeah, and he brings up Proust and Joyce, and it makes so much sense that look, we're still reading Proust, we're still reading Joyce, we're not reading Eugene Sue, we're not reading the realist novelists that were actually pretty, I guess, interesting politically at the time, but they were working with this ambiguity and dissonance. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because when I talk about my novels as political and thinking about ways in which the consciousness can be transferred, there's a kind of revolutionary aspect to novels. I'm not saying that it's not like this, every novel has to have this topic that does this. It's how the novel is done. And he's talking about ways in which the consciousness of characterization, of narration mode, the way in which narration mode recognizes fluidity and instability, etc. It's what makes ultimately that instability actually is a lot. Anyway, that's just me. A lot more real. There's a lot more reality that therefore we can bear in reading those novels. So. I absolutely thank you so much for bringing up Adorno. I really love his commentary on Proust, for instance. I think, again, even the way he says, okay, they talk about the snobism of Proust, but then he talks about the fact that, hey, he's very aware of it in the text, and look at what he does in terms of the long progression of Charlot to, Charlot down to the tailor, the Morel, who becomes the great man of the 10th.
There is a temptation, though, especially for committed writers or for readers like myself who want more politics in literature. There's a temptation to think that means realism. That means in particular a very gritty, detailed, empiricizing type of realism, one that zeroes in on suffering and determines the causes of it, gives them to the reader. This is what happened. These are the causes. These are the consequences. And Adorno is really useful in saying, absolutely not. The world doesn't work like that, and things aren't understood like that. You can't take a photograph of the world and expect it then to carry meaning. Writing has to be broken apart and the shards of it put down on the page so that we can see the way in which suffering works in the mind as well as on the body and in the world.
Thank you so much. I absolutely agree.
Well, I think your novels, like I say, they are hard. And I know it can sometimes be tempting to say, well, it's not, it's joyful and everything. But I heard an Irish critic, Declan Kyberd, once when I was an undergraduate, speak about Ulysses as a democratizing novel, a novel his father loved to read. Now, Ulysses is a beautiful novel, but it's not a novel that people are going to pick up and easily read. It's the type of novel that makes you work. Like, my dad is a reader, but he left school at 13. He's not going to read Ulysses. And it took me a long time to get to the point where that was okay. I would love him because I know he'd get a tremendous kick out of it. But the other the other extreme is to say, write novels for people like my father. And that would be wrong. That would be wrong. It wouldn't do the type of political work you want a novel to do if you just gave somebody information about the way of the world, the causes and the consequences, because what you want them to do is the term you used earlier. Did you use the term occupy or inhabit a
Both.
body?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You occupy, yeah.
And that's difficult. As a writer, it's difficult to do. As a reader, it's difficult to encounter. But it's the thing that works. I don't know. Is there anybody there signaling violently that they disagree or they agree? But I think not. I think Fred has asked for a source for the Adorno quote, and I'm really sorry. I should know it, but I haven't written it down.
I think it's in Notes on Literature, the book called Notes on Literature.
It is. There's an essay called "The Position of the Narrator." I think it might be that one. If it's not that one, I'll find it, Michael. I'll find it, Fred, and I'll send it to you.
We'll put it in. We send out the recording and the chat afterwards, so we can put that anything like that together and put that in.
I just want to note, Cynthia put up Jose Marti and Jose Rizal. They were the same era.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that if I can, Gina. But am I bumping anyone on the stack?
No.
I just had a very quick question, but go ahead,
please.
Cynthia.
Yeah, because I think you were
Cynthia,
next.
you go. Cynthia, you're speaking. Go, please. You haven't asked the question yet. You're next.
Well, first of all, I just really want to thank both of you, Gina and Patricia, for this exchange and for your generosity and the wide-ranging character of this conversation. And there's so much more to touch on. And your remarks, this is not what I was going to ask about, Gina, but your remarks earlier about, some of the difficulties you had in dealing with the terrain of sexual violence and rape and actually not wanting to put it in your novels is very interesting, because in another literature group, we're having a very tough conversation about this in relation to another novel by David Diop, very powerful novel about the First World War. But in any case, the mention of Jose Marti was partly because when I read your novel Insurrecto, I was interested in that. Like, Cuba doesn't appear, but it's part of that same moment, right, in U.S. imperial history. So I'm wondering if that was part of your thinking or engagement in any way, even though it doesn't appear in the novel, right? I'm just curious about that, and also to know more about the connection that is definitely in the novel between, how you're teasing out the relationship between settler colonialism in the United States and U.S. imperial wars, which, again, often those connections are not made. Some people do in political theory and some of the history, but a lot of those connections still kind of are not made. So that's an important part of the novel for me. So I don't know if you want to expand on either or of those two.
When the Philippine-American War is taught, usually it's taught through the Spanish-American War, because they went to war against Cuba. And here's what I know from the research that I've done. Months before the explosion on the Maine, the American ships were already moving toward Hong Kong, and they were told the Pacific Fleet in America. There wasn't a huge fleet; it was small. It wasn't. In fact, that's why America wanted to take the Philippines. They wanted to expand the Navy. Theodore Roosevelt, so he was the one. So it's taught through the Spanish-American War, Cuba. And the Philippines was at war against Spain, so the Americans used the Filipino revolutionaries who were in Hong Kong at the time in exile, moved them to the Philippines. May 1 was the May 1, 1898, and it was, the Maine had not yet exploded before the American ships were being told to go from Hong Kong to Manila. So it was already part of a plan that was very much part of the expansion of American global power that Theodore Roosevelt was very interested in. He was only, at the time, the Undersecretary of the Navy, but he was very ambitious. So Cuba and the Philippines in the American moment are actually very attached, because it was part of the Americans came to the Philippines as part of the Spanish-American War. Now, the Indian Wars, the war, the settler colonial, the use of the soldiers that were used by the American military to go into Spain, to go into Cuba and the Philippines, where, you know, if you go and look at them, looking at just what their histories were, where they had been beforehand, et cetera, a lot of them were, you know, very young people who, you know, coming from the farms, et cetera, the Midwest, the upstate New York, et cetera, who were, you know, obviously poor men who were part of the wars against the so-called Indian Wars, you know, the wars against the Apaches, one of the generals in the Philippines that were killed by the Filipinos, General Lawton, he was the person who captured Geronimo. So there's a lot of intersection of the settler colonial wars, simply because materially the actual soldiers of those wars were the same soldiers and officers sent to the Philippines. Here's the other thing: the Civil War generals, who were also who were Civil War soldiers who became generals later on. They, you know, the Union and Confederate military people, they were also in the Philippines, so they were all kind of together being genocidal in the Philippines. So the material connection of the Spanish-American War, Cuba, etc., to the Philippines. Look, this person, for instance, who was the colonel of, you know, the officer of Theodore Roosevelt, I forget his name, but he became one of the first governor generals of the Philippines after Governor General Taft, who was the very first governor general, who became obviously the president of the United States. So the connection of the early 20th century to the Philippines is very strong. There is a material historical connection between what was going on in the Philippines and what was going on and what happened in the States. Here's another one. John Pershing. John Pershing, you know, the chief of the expeditionary forces in Europe in World War I, his earlier career was in the Philippines. He was the governor of Mindanao. So he was the early military governor of Mindanao. So when he sets up when America sets up its first spy organization, so the first NSA, what's now the NSA, who does he call in World War I to help create it? He calls his fellow officers in the Philippines, because they were already doing that surveillance on Filipino revolutionaries, and they were already doing this extra constitutional stuff against Filipinos, because they could do it in the Philippines and not in America, spying on citizens. So the so-called founder of American surveillance, I forget his name. All of his stuff, his index cards, are in somewhere in San Diego. Huh?
Dulles, you mean, from the OSS, or
yes, the person who helped create that. He became actually a McCarthyite. He became a very, very strong. The spy system under McCarthy, that he helped create that, because he was already doing that spying on Hollywood actors, et cetera, the Japanese, all of those things. Anyway. So if you think about the kind of anti-democratic structures in America that became part of the American surveillance, policing, counterinsurgency stuff, the experimentation on that was done in countries like the Philippines, which makes a lot of sense because they could do it. So the operators that were doing that shit in the Philippines, they're the ones who become the makers of counter-surveillance, spying, NSA stuff, once it becomes a seeming necessity during World War I, and you know, and with all the other anti-democratic measures that they preferred with the Cold War. There's a direct historical material link.
Patricia.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Michael, I'm sorry, I skipped you. I've just seen that now, but you get the last question, I think, because we've just gone a little over time. So
Well, that's quite all right, because I could not, when reading the novel, there would be these moments where you would not translate into Spanish or English the indigenous language. Tagalog. I don't even know if I pronounce it correctly.
Tagalog.
When this would appear, yet I would try to enunciate whatever it was, because in a way, having that there untranslated seemed to me to be giving a wholeness to the gestalt of, giving the gestalt to the novel. And as an American, even though there's a whole history in my family of this whole thing about the US, there's this idea that everyone American is dominating the world. No, most of us in the US come from families that have been exploited for generations.
Absolutely.
And in the old
Yeah.
countries as well. But
Yeah.
there was a real sense of this is the real thing novel when that remained untranslated. Yet I don't know what those words were all about, even though I was, like, when we learn to speak, we learn how to say things based on the context in which the new words appear. And I found that so instructive, Gina, in what is allowed in writing. It was beautiful to me that you did that, or you and the editor decided upon that. And the other thing that strikes me is that sometimes in our discussion of your novel, I would take an aside and go online and see how big the Philippines is. And I've never been west of California, but it must be this huge country, because I see how many islands, and there must be a tremendous difference from the people on the northern islands to those on the southern islands, and then again the urban to the rural. But that's a whole other session that we would have to do. But why did you? Is there anything you could say on keeping the? Cynthia just told me gestalt is a
No, stop.
Tagalog word. In any case, that's just it's not, again, I don't pose questions.
It was actually, those are decisions that I made. Definitely, they are writer decisions. There was actually a weird copy editor who changed all of the words that were all not. The other thing is that they're not italicized. They are Roman. And that was also very deliberate. There was a copy editor who made them all italicized. And then my editor said,
I'm foreign.
and my editor said, Gina, I'm sorry. They're definitely not going to be italicized in the text. That's very wrong. If you could just skip that. And I said to my editor, I'm not reading the text until it's fixed. So
really?
Yeah.
Right on, Gina.
Yeah, so I'm not reading that shit until it's fixed.
And
I thought it was very. It was a power move by a white copy editor, and I did think that it was not something I should be dealing with. So anyway, no, they were all my choices. If I felt a translation was needed, again, what Patricia was saying, the kindness to the reader. I'm not really. I'm not opposed to that, but when I felt that it needed, and I'm going to be honest, the ones that that were completely untranslated, those were waray, because I was also doing this to Tagalog people. So, so I would bet that they were waray. That's what I would bet.
And one of our co-audience people has asked me, when seeing me on Stack, if I was going to ask about why the chapter numbering as it was, which was asked several times over the 2 weeks in which we discussed your novel. Now, to me, I kind of have my own way with that, and I think each reader would have their own way with that. But go ahead.
That's not really a question that I would answer. I think that is a reader question. I think that that what the reader gets from that jumbling would be very interesting in terms of how the reader takes in the text. there was a need for me to do it because of my concept of history and entanglement of the current regime, the Marcos regime, with that history. So it's so jumbled, and so for me, I needed that jumbling. And what I will say though is that people have asked me, how did you write this? Did you write this script first or that script first? And I will say this: I wrote it as it was written.
Wow.
I wrote it as it was written. That first chapter, chapter 20, was the first chapter in the book. The one thing that was, as I said earlier, was different was that the chapter ones were things that came later in the writing, but the interspersing of stories, that was more or less how I decided to write. Partly, I think what Patricia was saying, partly out of pleasure. For it was my own pleasure to kind of have a different voice, have a different story every so often. I was working on a different novel at the time, which was very oppressive for me, and I was using this as a kind of recess, but then it became really interesting to me. And to be honest, even the ending of the novel, once the novel was ended, I thought, oh my God, the novel's over. I was just, okay, the novel's over. But that's one thing I will say. I wrote it the way it came out, and I did twiddle around with the numbers, with the numbering, and I did work on the chapter titles. Those were after the text, figuring out, for instance, how the chapter titles, the chapter number 1 titles, could actually be a kind of sentence. And I did get that from Calvino, If on a Winter's Night a Traveling.
Huh. I didn't get that.
Um,
Now I have to go back and look at that.
Patricia, is there anything that you would like to say? I mean, we are over our time, and Gina, you both, everyone here has been very generous, our buzzword of the day, with each other and our time. But is there anything you would like to close with, Patricia? And then you also, Gina.
The only thing I would say, there's a huge amount, I think, to Gina's philosophy of writing that I haven't touched on, that we haven't. So I would encourage people to go to Gina's blog. If you scroll up in the chat, I put it in. In particular, I think when the question about Filipino writers, that would be recommended. I think Gina herself has some great points in some of the blogs about the way in which these writers have been treated. And there's sort of clues as well, I think, to the way in which Gina's novels asked to be read. So it's well worth going to some of those. I didn't get the chance to bring up Benedict Anderson. And he has written on I think you used the phrase, was it neo-feudal, Gina? You said feudal.
The semi-feudal. He wrote about cacique democracy.
Yeah, and that's an essay in New Left Review. I don't know if people have access to New Left Review, but I have a copy of that. I think if anybody wants it, I'm sure.
And Anderson was my pen pal. I call him my pen pal because I made him read my second novel, Raimundo Mata, because there was something about it, because it's about Rizal, and he loves Rizal. Rizal is completely in imagined communities, and it's a center. The Filipino novel, No Limitang is the center of his imagining imagined communities. So I sent him Raimundo Mata, and we just started writing to each other. And in fact, before Insurrecto was published, he read it, and he died a few months after. Insurrecto didn't kill Ben Anderson, but when I went to Cornell to do a talk on the Philippine-American War and the concept of tragedy and the poetics, he was the one who introduced Insurrecto to the audience, and I'm still really, really honored by that he kept reading my work. He kept reading it. He was always quarreling with me about my work because he was very much a lover of realist novels. The realist novel. So he said, "No, Gina, you should read blah blah." I said, "No, Ben." So it was just but his thinking about history is so powerful.
Yeah. And there would be no better person to quarrel with, I think.
I was constantly quarreling with it.
I think that would be it from me. Unless Gina, you wanted to.
I just want to thank you, Patricia. I think your readings of the book. I mean, so many. I've done so many different conversations, and I was really. I just felt really just the way you're reading history and narration and the small bits that you were taking from it. To be honest, every single passage that you asked me to read, they're really key. They're actually passages that I often read for in public, and so thank you very much, Patricia, for all of the work you've done.
I think I'm going to speak for all of us. I don't think this will be disagreed upon, but you make us the readers we are. So thank you for your novels. Stay writing, please. Stay writing. I'm looking forward to your next one.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You stay warm and dry.
The Marxist
Thank
Education Project
Thank
and
you
Michael in
so much.
particular, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
It's
Yeah.
been a pleasure.
Mabuhay to all of you.
Yes,
I'm going-
Thank you very much.
I'm going to go
I
and have
just
my
wanted
dinner.
to have one last word here in that I have approached so many people, even though you might like the Marxist Education Project, as I do, it's very much something I put time into every day. I am still dismayed by how many people who study the world as it is say to me, literature, I don't read that. And it's shocking to me that there are still people who say that, but it happens. Yet we had a great group today, and my love of literature is just a little more deeper now. Thank you so much, Gina.
And Marx was such a reader of literature. Hello.
He loved his
That's
Balzac
all. Yeah.
and his Shakespeare, but he read it all.
read
And I
everything.
think he would probably be fairly fluent in Finnegan's Wake were he alive today.
He could read Finnegan's Wake.
Yes, yes. Thanks to everyone for showing up,
Thank you.
and there were 4 people who registered but couldn't be here, but they will be seeing the tape, and I keep calling it a tape. This is not the eagle stuck in the detritus of the
Capitalist
Valley Mall.
detritus.
But the recording, and Fred talks to me about aging myself, referring to recordings as tapes, but I can't help myself. Thank you again. Beautiful, wonderful.
Thank you so much.